"Don't ruin my wife's party," my son yelled, his voice a venomous hiss that cut through the cacophony of the room. He shoved me, and the force of it sent a jarring shockwave through my aging bones. An hour later, the very same people who had watched my humiliation in stony silence were now crying in a symphony of panic. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, what my life had become. My own home, the sanctuary I had painstakingly built over 4 decades, looked like a battlefield after a hurricane had torn through its heart. 40 people, maybe more, all strangers to me, were screaming, their voices blending into a shrill, chaotic chorus with the blaring, bass-heavy music that seemed to make the very foundations of the house tremble. The kitchen floor, which I had mopped just that morning, was a glittering mosaic of broken bottles, their jagged edges catching the frantic, pulsing lights of some portable disco ball someone had brought. My new television, the one I'd saved for a year to buy, a small indulgence for my quiet evenings, had a spiderweb of cracks spreading across its screen like a frozen lightning strike. And the walls, the soft eggshell white walls I had painted with my own 2 hands just 2 months ago, were desecrated with abstract splatters of red wine, looking like the bloody handprints of some monstrous beast. Danielle, my daughter-in-law, had decided to throw a party for her co-workers without so much as a word to me. Not a question, not a suggestion, just a declaration made an hour before the first guest arrived. For 3 agonizing hours, I had tried to remain a calm, invisible presence in my own home. I had woven through the throngs of laughing, drinking strangers, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, as I watched them systematically destroy everything I had built with so much love and effort. The velvet couch, a deep emerald green, which I had purchased with the last of my savings after my retirement, now bore the ugly, puckered scars of cigarette burns. Little black holes in the fabric that felt like wounds in my own skin. The coffee table, a beautiful mahogany piece I had inherited from my mother, her most prized possession, was buried under a mountain of dirty glasses, sticky rings of condensation, and overflowing ashtrays that spilled their foul contents onto the polished wood. The cloying, acrid smell of stale alcohol and cheap smoke had seeped into every fiber of my curtains, a scent I knew would take weeks, if not months, to fully exorcise. The Persian rug, the last gift my dear husband gave me before he passed away, its intricate patterns telling a story of love and shared memories, was now marred by dark, spreading stains of beer that had undoubtedly filtered deep into its very soul. My home was no longer my own. It had been invaded, colonized by a tribe of thoughtless revelers. I discovered to my horror that a woman I didn't know, a giggling girl with smeared mascara, had thrown up in my main bathroom. She hadn't bothered to clean it up. The sight and the stench of it made my stomach churn with a nausea so profound I had to back away, slamming the door shut on the violation. Another guest, a man in a ridiculously expensive suit, had managed to spill a vibrant red pasta sauce all over my embroidered white tablecloth, the one I reserved only for Christmas and Thanksgiving. The one that held the ghosts of 100 happy family meals. The furniture was all out of place, shoved into awkward angles to make room for a makeshift dance floor. There were crushed cigarette butts extinguished in the soil of my beloved houseplants, their green leaves wilting in protest. And then I saw it, my favorite crystal lamp, a delicate antique piece that had cast a warm, gentle glow over my evenings for 30 years, lay in 1,000 glittering shards on the floor, the victim of some errant, drunken dance move, when I had finally gathered the courage to approach Danielle, to plead with her to ask her friends to be more careful. She had looked at me with that saccharine plastic smile she always reserved for me. It was a smile that never reached her eyes, a smile that was more of a baring of teeth. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Audrey," she'd cooed, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'll take care of everything afterward. We'll have it sparkling in no time." But I knew, with the weary certainty of long experience, that it was a lie. It was always a lie with her. Every promise, every hollow apology, every breezy, "I'll fix it later, Mrs. Audrey." That slipped from her perfectly painted lips was just one more falsehood I had chosen to believe. One more bitter pill I had swallowed for the sake of maintaining a fragile peace in my fractured family. Robert, my son, my only child, was out on the back deck, his laughter booming over the music as he clinked glasses with his friends. He was oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. It was as if this wasn't his mother's home being desecrated before his eyes. It was as if the 40 years I had spent working, saving, and sacrificing to buy every piece of furniture, every delicate ornament, every single detail of this house meant absolutely nothing to him. The house wasn't just brick and mortar to me. It was the repository of my life's story, and he was letting strangers tear out the pages. I walked over to him, my steps feeling heavy and slow. I tried to keep my voice low, a desperate attempt not to make a scene, but a frantic urgency was clawing at my throat. I needed him to see, to understand what was happening. I touched his arm gently, a familiar gesture I'd used since he was a small boy. "Robert, please," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "You have to talk to Danielle. Things are getting out of control. My house, it's not a bar. I never gave permission for this. This madness." I explained that I had just found one of her friends vomiting in my bathroom, that there were stains all over the house that would cost a small fortune to clean, that my most cherished possessions were being broken one by one, I reminded him, my voice cracking with emotion, that this house was my home, the place where I had planned to live out my final years in tranquility and peace. Robert turned to look at me, and in that moment I saw a stranger. His eyes, the same deep blue eyes I had gazed into the day he was born, were clouded over with something I didn't recognize. He was my son, but the man looking down at me was someone else entirely. He swayed a little as he pushed himself up from his chair. He had been drinking all night, and the alcohol had peeled away the veneer of the dutiful son, revealing something dark and ugly underneath. His face transformed, twisting into an expression of cold fury that sent a shiver of genuine fear down my spine. The expression I saw there was not that of the sweet boy I had raised, nor the proud man who had gotten married 5 years ago. It was something cold, cruel, and filled with a seething contempt that pierced me like 1,000 invisible daggers. He shoved me. Not a small push, but a violent, forceful shove that sent me stumbling backward against the hallway wall. My back hit the hard edge of the doorframe with a sickening thud, and a sharp, electric pain shot up my spine. But the physical pain, as intense as it was nothing compared to the agony that ripped through my chest when he opened his mouth. His words were not just yelled. They were projectiles, hurled at me with a rage I had never witnessed in him before. Every syllable was a carefully crafted weapon, designed to wound me in the deepest, most vulnerable part of my being. "Don't ruin my wife's party," he spat, his face inches from mine, his breath hot with alcohol. "This is your problem for being so bitter. Always trying to ruin everything good that happens to us. Go to your room and leave us alone." The party, for one suspended moment, went completely silent. The music seemed to die, the laughter caught in 40 throats. It was as if they had all witnessed something obscene, a sacred taboo being broken. I felt all their eyes on me, a crushing weight of unwanted attention. Some pairs of eyes held a flicker of pity, others were filled with acute discomfort, and a few, the ones that made my skin crawl, held the cruel, detached satisfaction of someone who enjoys watching another person's complete and utter humiliation. But then, as quickly as it had vanished, the noise returned. The music blared back to life, the chatter resumed, the laughter rang out once more, as if nothing had happened. As if seeing a 69-year-old woman being shoved and screamed at by her own son was just a minor, forgettable interruption in their evening's entertainment. I stood there, pressed against the wall, the imprint of the doorframe burning into my back. I could feel the hot sting of tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the pleasure of seeing me cry. I would not become the pathetic spectacle they seemed to be enjoying so much. Danielle appeared behind Robert, materializing like a malevolent ghost. She held a glass of red wine in her hand, and that smile I hated more than anything in the world, was plastered across her face. She didn't say a single word, but her eyes, cold and triumphant, said everything. She had won. Oh, that's what she thought. Her friends, a coven of young, fashionable women, surrounded her like a protective shield, whispering things I couldn't quite hear. But I could imagine their venomous words, comments about the bitter, joyless mother-in-law who didn't know how to have fun. I watched as they all looked at me with that toxic cocktail of pity and scorn that the young often reserve for older women they consider obsolete and irrelevant. With a dignity I didn't know I possessed, I pushed myself off the wall and walked slowly, deliberately, toward my bedroom. It was the only part of the house that still felt like it belonged to me, my last remaining sanctuary. I locked the door behind me, the click of the bolt sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the room. From within my haven, I could still hear the party raging on, the thumping bass, the shrieks of laughter, the soundtrack to my home's violation. I sat on the edge of my bed, the familiar floral quilt cool beneath my trembling hands. And for the first time in 69 years of life, I felt completely and utterly alone in the world. The noise continued unabated until the obscene hour of 4 in the morning. Music, laughter, shouting. The percussive sound of more bottles breaking, more unknown voices echoing through every corner of my home. When the last car finally screeched away from the curb and an unnatural silence descended, I didn't leave my room. I knew what I would find. I knew my home would be destroyed, and I simply didn't have the strength to face it right then. It was better to wait, to let the darkness hide the worst of the devastation until the dawn forced me to confront the reality of what had happened. But as I lay there in the suffocating darkness, listening to the ringing silence the storm had left in its wake, something inside me began to shift. It was a subtle, tectonic movement deep within my soul. It wasn't sadness or pain that I was feeling anymore. Those emotions had been burned away by the intensity of Robert's rage and Danielle's triumph. This was something different, something cold and sharp and calculating that I had never experienced before. Robert had crossed a line, a point of no return. He had humiliated me in front of strangers. He had laid his hands on me as if I were nothing more than an annoying obstacle in his path. He had screamed at me as if I, the woman who gave him life, meant nothing to him at all. My whole life, I had been the mother who forgave everything, the one who justified every mistake, who endured every slight, who swallowed every hurt, all for the sake of love. But that night, in the profound silence of my besieged home, I made a decision that would change everything, forever. I was no longer going to be the same Audrey Miller. The woman who had walked into this bedroom hours ago was gone, and she was never coming back. Tomorrow, I would start remembering things I had preferred to forget. Tomorrow, I would start asking the right questions and seeking out the answers I had been avoiding for far too long. Because if my own son could treat me like that, if he could physically shove me in my own house and verbally assault me in front of a crowd of strangers, then perhaps there were many, many other things I didn't know about him. The morning arrived with a different kind of silence than usual. It was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, charged silence that comes before a storm, and I was ready to become that storm. When I finally emerged from my room at noon the next day, the house looked as if it had been hit by a tornado. But it wasn't just the physical mess that tore at my heart. It was the crushing certainty that something had irrevocably shattered between my son and me. As I began the grim task of cleaning, picking up shards of broken glass with careful fingers and plucking cigarette butts from the soil of my violated plants, I couldn't stop thinking about how we had arrived at this desolate place. I remembered the day Robert was born 34 years ago. I was in labor for 18 excruciating hours in a stark, understaffed public hospital where the nurses barely had time to glance in my direction. His father had died in a tragic construction accident when I was 6 months pregnant, a grief so profound it had threatened to swallow me whole. I faced everything alone. When they finally placed him in my arms, that tiny, wrinkled, red-faced baby, I made him a solemn promise. I promised him that he would never lack for anything, and I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at a textile factory for 15 years, my days a blur of roaring machines and aching muscles, just to pay for his private school. My hands became calloused and rough, and my back developed a permanent stoop from bending over those relentless sewing machines. But he never wore patched-up uniforms like the other kids in our neighborhood. He never lacked for new textbooks or sharp pencils. He never, not once, went to bed hungry. He never had to walk home in the pouring rain because we didn't have the money for the bus. I made sure of it. When he turned 18 and announced he wanted to study engineering, a dream so far beyond anything I could have imagined for myself, I sold the few pieces of gold jewelry my mother had left me to pay for his first year's tuition. They were the only tangible memories I had of her, but I didn't hesitate for a single second. Robert was my future, my hope, my entire reason for existing. I took on extra work on weekends, cleaning cavernous, empty office buildings to pay for his expensive textbooks. And when he contracted a severe case of pneumonia in his second year, I spent every penny of my savings on private doctors and medication to ensure he received the best possible care. I remember the day he graduated as if it were yesterday. I was there, sitting in the front row, wearing a simple black dress I had bought at the thrift store because it was the only decent thing I owned. Tears streamed down my face when they called his name. I cried when I saw him walk across the podium, so tall and handsome in his cap and gown. I cried when he hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "This is all thanks to you, Mom." On that day, I believed with all my heart that every sacrifice, every long hour, every lonely night had been worth it. Then came the good jobs, the impressive salary of $3,000 a month, the elegant apartment he rented in the city center. I continued to live in the same small house where I had raised him, but I didn't care. I was bursting with pride, knowing that my son had succeeded, that he was a success, that he would never have to suffer the hardships and deprivations that had defined my own life. When he met Danielle 6 years ago, I tried with all my might to be happy for him. She was beautiful, well-educated, and came from a well-off family who had given her everything I couldn't give Robert. But from the very first day we met, something in her eyes made me deeply uncomfortable. It was the way she looked at me, a quick, dismissive appraisal, as if I were an old, unfashionable piece of furniture that had to be tolerated but would be replaced as soon as possible. It was the way she talked about her parents, always casually mentioning their trips to Europe, their dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, their beach house in the Hamptons. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Perhaps it was normal for a daughter-in-law not to feel an immediate connection with her mother-in-law. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive, a relic from a different generation. But then I started noticing things, small but significant changes. Robert started canceling our long-standing Sunday lunches because Danielle had other, more exciting plans. He stopped dropping by to visit me during the week because, as he explained sheepishly, his wife thought it was immature for a grown man to visit his mother so often. The first time I truly felt like an outsider in my own son's life was at their wedding. I had saved for 2 long years to buy him the engagement ring he wanted to give her, a breathtaking 2-carat solitaire that cost $8,000. To afford it, I sold my old reliable car and started taking the bus to work, adding an extra hour to my commute each way. But I never told him about the sacrifice. I just wanted him to be happy. When the wedding day arrived, I found myself seated in the 3rd row, while Danielle's parents occupied the seats of honor right at the front. In the official wedding photographs, I appeared only in the last few group shots, almost completely hidden behind a crowd of Danielle's distant cousins. Danielle had orchestrated every single detail of that lavish ceremony, and it was painfully clear that my role in my son's life had been permanently downgraded. The first few years of their marriage were characterized by a gradual, painful estrangement. The phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. Robert always had an excuse at the ready: a deadline at work, a social commitment, a last-minute trip that Danielle had planned. When I called him, he often answered with an audible sigh, his voice clipped and hurried, as if my voice were an annoying interruption in his new, perfect life. Then came the comments, small, casual cruelties wrapped in the guise of supposed concern. "Mom, Danielle thinks maybe you should get a hobby, something to keep you busy so you don't feel so lonely." Or, "Don't you think it would be better if you made some friends your own age? Danielle says it's important to have an appropriate social circle." Every comment was a small, precise stab to the heart, but I swallowed the pain and smiled, because I thought that if I was patient, if I was understanding, if I didn't cause any problems, things would eventually get better. I foolishly believed that the bond of love I had forged with my son over 30 years was stronger than any external influence. With a dignity I didn't know I possessed, I pushed myself off the wall and walked slowly, deliberately, toward my bedroom. It was the only part of the house that still felt like it belonged to me, my last remaining sanctuary. I locked the door behind me, the click of the bolt sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the room. From within my haven, I could still hear the party raging on, the thumping bass, the shrieks of laughter, the soundtrack to my home's violation. I sat on the edge of my bed, the familiar floral quilt cool beneath my trembling hands. And for the first time in 69 years of life, I felt completely and utterly alone in the world. The noise continued unabated until the obscene hour of 4 a.m. Music, laughter, shouting. The percussive sound of more bottles breaking, more unknown voices echoing through every corner of my home. When the last car finally screeched away from the curb and an unnatural silence descended, I didn't leave my room. I knew what I would find. I knew my home would be destroyed, and I simply didn't have the strength to face it right then. It was better to wait, to let the darkness hide the worst of the devastation until the dawn forced me to confront the reality of what had happened. But as I lay there in the suffocating darkness, listening to the ringing silence the storm had left in its wake, something inside me began to shift. It was a subtle, tectonic movement deep within my soul. It wasn't sadness or pain that I was feeling anymore. Those emotions had been burned away by the intensity of Robert's rage and Danielle's triumph. This was something different, something cold and sharp and calculating that I had never experienced before. Robert had crossed a line, a point of no return. He had humiliated me in front of strangers. He had laid his hands on me as if I were nothing more than an annoying obstacle in his path. He had screamed at me as if I, the woman who gave him life, meant nothing to him at all. My whole life, I had been the mother who forgave everything, the one who justified every mistake, who endured every slight, who swallowed every hurt, all for the sake of love. But that night, in the profound silence of my besieged home, I made a decision that would change everything, forever. I was no longer going to be the same Audrey Miller. The woman who had walked into this bedroom hours ago was gone, and she was never coming back. Tomorrow, I would start remembering things I had preferred to forget. Tomorrow, I would start asking the right questions and seeking out the answers I had been avoiding for far too long. Because if my own son could treat me like that, if he could physically shove me in my own house and verbally assault me in front of a crowd of strangers, then perhaps there were many, many other things I didn't know about him. The morning arrived with a different kind of silence than usual. It was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, charged silence that comes before a storm. And I was ready to become that storm. When I finally emerged from my room at noon the next day, the house looked as if it had been hit by a tornado. But it wasn't just the physical mess that tore at my heart. It was the crushing certainty that something had irrevocably shattered between my son and me. As I began the grim task of cleaning, picking up shards of broken glass with careful fingers and plucking cigarette butts from the soil of my violated plants, I couldn't stop thinking about how we had arrived at this desolate place. I remembered the day Robert was born 34 years ago. I was in labor for 18 excruciating hours in a stark, understaffed public hospital where the nurses barely had time to glance in my direction. His father had died in a tragic construction accident when I was 6 months pregnant, a grief so profound it had threatened to swallow me whole. I faced everything alone. When they finally placed him in my arms, that tiny, wrinkled, red-faced baby, I made him a solemn promise. I promised him that he would never lack for anything, and I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at a textile factory for 15 years, my days a blur of roaring machines and aching muscles, just to pay for his private school. My hands became calloused and rough, and my back developed a permanent stoop from bending over those relentless sewing machines. But he never wore patched-up uniforms like the other kids in our neighborhood. He never lacked for new textbooks or sharp pencils. He never, not once, went to bed hungry. He never had to walk home in the pouring rain because we didn't have the money for the bus. I made sure of it. When he turned 18 and announced he wanted to study engineering, a dream so far beyond anything I could have imagined for myself, I sold the few pieces of gold jewelry my mother had left me to pay for his first year's tuition. They were the only tangible memories I had of her, but I didn't hesitate for a single second. Robert was my future, my hope, my entire reason for existing. I took on extra work on weekends, cleaning cavernous, empty office buildings to pay for his expensive textbooks. And when he contracted a severe case of pneumonia in his second year, I spent every penny of my savings on private doctors and medication to ensure he received the best possible care. I remember the day he graduated as if it were yesterday. I was there, sitting in the front row, wearing a simple black dress I had bought at the thrift store because it was the only decent thing I owned. Tears streamed down my face when they called his name. I cried when I saw him walk across the podium, so tall and handsome in his cap and gown. I cried when he hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "This is all thanks to you, Mom." On that day, I believed with all my heart that every sacrifice, every long hour, every lonely night had been worth it. Then came the good jobs, the impressive salary of $3,000 a month, the elegant apartment he rented in the city center. I continued to live in the same small house where I had raised him, but I didn't care. I was bursting with pride, knowing that my son had succeeded, that he was a success, that he would never have to suffer the hardships and deprivations that had defined my own life. When he met Danielle 6 years ago, I tried with all my might to be happy for him. She was beautiful, well-educated, and came from a well-off family who had given her everything I couldn't give Robert. But from the very first day we met, something in her eyes made me deeply uncomfortable. It was the way she looked at me, a quick, dismissive appraisal, as if I were an old, unfashionable piece of furniture that had to be tolerated but would be replaced as soon as possible. It was the way she talked about her parents, always casually mentioning their trips to Europe, their dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, their beach house in the Hamptons. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Perhaps it was normal for a daughter-in-law not to feel an immediate connection with her mother-in-law. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive, a relic from a different generation. But then I started noticing things, small but significant changes. Robert started canceling our long-standing Sunday lunches because Danielle had other, more exciting plans. He stopped dropping by to visit me during the week because, as he explained sheepishly, his wife thought it was immature for a grown man to visit his mother so often. The first time I truly felt like an outsider in my own son's life was at their wedding. I had saved for 2 long years to buy him the engagement ring he wanted to give her, a breathtaking 2-carat solitaire that cost $8,000. To afford it, I sold my old reliable car and started taking the bus to work, adding an extra hour to my commute each way. But I never told him about the sacrifice. I just wanted him to be happy. When the wedding day arrived, I found myself seated in the 3rd row, while Danielle's parents occupied the seats of honor right at the front. In the official wedding photographs, I appeared only in the last few group shots, almost completely hidden behind a crowd of Danielle's distant cousins. Danielle had orchestrated every single detail of that lavish ceremony, and it was painfully clear that my role in my son's life had been permanently downgraded. The first few years of their marriage were characterized by a gradual, painful estrangement. The phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. Robert always had an excuse at the ready: a deadline at work, a social commitment, a last-minute trip that Danielle had planned. When I called him, he often answered with an audible sigh, his voice clipped and hurried, as if my voice were an annoying interruption in his new, perfect life. Then came the comments, small, casual cruelties wrapped in the guise of supposed concern. "Mom, Danielle thinks maybe you should get a hobby, something to keep you busy so you don't feel so lonely." Or, "Don't you think it would be better if you made some friends your own age? Danielle says it's important to have an appropriate social circle." Every comment was a small, precise stab to the heart, but I swallowed the pain and smiled, because I thought that if I was patient, if I was understanding, if I didn't cause any problems, things would eventually get better. I foolishly believed that the bond of love I had forged with my son over 30 years was stronger than any external influence. 2 years ago, when I turned 67, I organized a small birthday dinner at my house. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking all of Robert's childhood favorites: roast turkey with gravy, creamy mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and a freshly baked pumpkin pie. I set the table with my good china, lit candles, and waited. For 2 hours I sat alone at my beautifully set table. He never came. He called me the next day with a rushed, insincere apology, but I could hear Danielle laughing in the background as he spoke. It was then that I began to suspect that something more sinister was going on. It wasn't just emotional distance. It wasn't just a lack of time. There was something calculated in the way they kept me at arm's length. something intentional in the way Danielle had systematically taken control of every single aspect of my son's life. Last night, when Robert shoved me against that wall, when he screamed at me in front of all those strangers, when I saw the undisguised satisfaction gleaming in Danielle's eyes, I finally belatedly understood the whole truth. It hadn't been a gradual, natural process of a son growing up and forming his own family. It had been a deliberate, strategic campaign to erase me from their lives. And I, in my blind, unconditional love, had cooperated with my own disappearance. Now, as I finished cleaning up the last remnants of that hideous party, I realized that the time had come to stop being the mother who forgives everything and start being the woman who defends herself. Because maybe there were more things I didn't know. Maybe there were more betrayals I hadn't yet uncovered. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start asking the questions I had been avoiding for far too long. The first sign that something was terribly wrong arrived 3 days after the party, when I went to check my mailbox. Tucked between the usual bills and junk mail, I found a crisp, official-looking envelope from the county registry office, an institution I hadn't expected to hear from. My hands trembled as I carefully tore it open, and what I read inside made me feel as if the solid ground were crumbling beneath my feet. It was a formal notification regarding a recent real estate transaction related to my property, my house, the one I had bought with my own 2 hands, working for 20 long years, the one I had paid for, penny by agonizing penny, the one I believed, with absolute conviction, was completely and entirely mine. According to the document, there had been a significant ownership update 6 months ago. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear the frantic rhythm in my ears. I immediately called Robert, but his phone rang straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again. I called 5 more times, my desperation growing with each unanswered ring. Nothing. Finally, with shaking fingers, I sent him a text message. I urgently need to talk to you about some property papers that just arrived. He replied 4 hours later. A curt, dismissive message. I'm busy. Mom, we'll talk tomorrow. But I couldn't wait until tomorrow. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink, tossing and turning in my bed, my mind racing as I tried to remember when, or if, I had signed any document related to the house. And then, like a flash of lightning illuminating a dark, forgotten corner of my memory, something I had completely blocked out came rushing back to me. 8 months ago, Robert and Danielle had shown up at my house one afternoon, their faces wreathed in bright, affectionate smiles. They said they had just come to visit, that they missed me and wanted to spend some quality time together. Danielle had even brought a bouquet of my favorite flowers and a chocolate cake from the expensive bakery downtown. It had seemed strange at the time, because she had never before shown that kind of spontaneous warmth or generosity. But in my desperate hope for a better relationship, I had thought that perhaps she was finally making an effort. During the visit, amidst the light-hearted chatter and cake, Robert had placed a stack of papers in front of me. It's just to update the information for the house, Mom, he'd said, his tone casual and reassuring. You know, the government is always changing the requirements. This will save you a lot of problems with taxes later on. I had trusted him completely. He was my son. He was a successful engineer. He understood these complicated things far better than I did. The papers were thick with many pages of small, dense print that made my eyes ache just looking at it. I was too lazy, too trusting to read it all. Robert had simply pointed to the lines where I needed to sign. Danielle had smiled at me, that same plastic smile, and told me how smart I was to keep everything in order. So I signed where they told me to, without reading, without asking, without suspecting a single thing. Now, with that official registry document clutched in my hand, I understood with sickening clarity what I had really signed that afternoon. They hadn't been simple updates to information. It had been something far, far more serious. I had put my own home, my life's greatest achievement, at risk, and I hadn't even known it. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and drove to the county registry office. The young woman who assisted me looked at me with an expression of deep pity as I haltingly explained my situation. Ma'am, she said, her voice soft, according to our files, you signed a document where you ceded 50% of the property to your son, Robert Miller. You also signed an authorization for him to make future transactions related to the property without your direct consent. I felt as though I had been punched in the stomach, the air knocked out of my lungs. Does that mean he can sell the house without me knowing? I asked, my voice a barely audible whisper. The girl nodded slowly, her eyes full of sorrow. Technically, yes. He has the legal power to make decisions about the property. I walked out of that building like a zombie, the world around me a blurry, meaningless haze. My own house, the one I had bought with the sweat of my brow and the ache of my back, was no longer completely mine. My son had tricked me, had manipulated my trust to have me sign my own financial death sentence, and I had been so naive, so blinded by love that I hadn't even noticed. But that wasn't all. When I got home, a cold, gnawing suspicion prompted me to check the other important documents I kept in a locked box in my dresser. My bank certificates of deposit, my insurance policies, the papers for my small pension, everything was there. But as I reviewed them with a new, fearful scrutiny, I found inconsistencies I had never noticed before. In my savings account, the one I had diligently contributed to at the same bank for 15 years, there were transactions I didn't recognize. Withdrawals of $500, $1,000, $1,500, appearing every few months like clockwork. When I added them all up, the total came to more than $15,000 that had vanished from my account in the last year and a half. I called the bank immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mrs. Miller, the polite man on the phone explained, all of these withdrawals were authorized by the person you registered as an authorized signer on your account. My blood ran cold. What authorized person? I asked, my voice shaking. Your son, Robert Miller. He has had complete access to your account for the past 2 years. 2 years. That meant that even before the party, long before he had shoved me and screamed at me, Robert had already been systematically stealing from me. It wasn't just disrespect or ingratitude. It was a cold, calculated, long-term plan to take everything I owned. I hung up the phone and sat there in my sunlit kitchen, trying to process the enormity of the betrayal. My son, the child I had raised alone, the man I had given everything to, was a thief. And Danielle, I knew with absolute certainty, knew everything. She was not just a bystander. She was his co-conspirator. I then remembered other things, other small moments I had ignored or explained away. The time Robert had asked me to sign some bank papers to simplify my paperwork. The time Danielle had casually commented that it was so smart to have someone you trust managing your finances when you're getting older. The time they had both convinced me to change my will to avoid legal problems later on. Every memory was another piece of the puzzle. And the pieces were finally starting to form a clear, horrifying picture. It hadn't been a coincidence. It hadn't been a gradual drift. It had been a planned theft, a meticulous and cruel campaign executed step by step over years, taking full advantage of my blind trust and my unconditional love. That afternoon, when Robert finally deigned to call me back, his voice was laced with irritation. "What papers are you talking about, Mom?" I calmly explained what I had discovered at the registry office, and there was a long, telling silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," he finally said, his tone now condescending, patronizing, "you don't understand anything about these legal matters. Those documents are to protect you, so that when you're very old, you don't have to worry about these complicated things. Danielle and I are just looking out for your best interests." "And the money? The money that has been disappearing from my account?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Another silence. "What money?" "Mom, I think you're getting confused. Maybe you should talk to the doctor. Sometimes stress can cause memory problems." That was it. That was the moment I knew for sure. He wasn't just stealing from me. He also thought I was too stupid to notice. He was treating me as if I were a senile old woman who couldn't comprehend her own affairs. "Robert, I want you to come over tomorrow so we can talk about this face to face." "I can't tomorrow, Mom. Danielle and I have plans. But don't worry about these things. Everything is under control." When he hung up, I stood there with the phone in my hand, feeling something definitively and permanently break inside my chest. It wasn't just the financial betrayal. It was the complete and utter contempt with which he treated me, as if I were a problem that had to be managed, an annoying obstacle in their perfect plans. But they didn't know something important about me. I wasn't the naive, helpless woman they thought I was. I had survived the death of my husband. I had raised a son entirely on my own. I had worked for decades to build the life I had, and if they thought for 1 second that they were going to steal everything from me without a fight, they were very, very wrong. That night, I made a decision. I was no longer going to be the silent victim. I was going to find out exactly what else they had taken from me, and then I was going to get it all back. But I would do it my way, in silence, with patience, and with the same steely determination I had used to build my life from scratch. Robert and Danielle were about to find out that they had completely and fatally underestimated the woman they thought they could rob with impunity. For the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own life. Every morning, I woke up not with the familiar ache of grief, but with a cold, sharp determination I had never felt before. Robert and Danielle thought I was a confused, frail old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs, but they were about to discover just how profoundly wrong they were. I started by making a meticulous list of every single document I could remember signing in the last 3 years. There were a surprising number of them. Robert had a habit of showing up with Danielle, always smiling, always armed with some convincing, plausible excuse for me to put my signature on papers I didn't fully read. "It's for your security, Mom. It's to save you problems with the government. It's better to be safe than sorry." Every piece of paper I had signed now seemed coated in a layer of suspicion. I methodically checked every drawer, every folder, every dusty envelope I kept in my house. I unearthed copies of documents I didn't even remember receiving, bank authorizations giving Robert sweeping powers, inexplicable changes to my insurance policies, modifications to my will that heavily favored him, and something that made my hands tremble with a cold dread, a durable power of attorney that gave Robert total and absolute control over all my financial decisions in the event that I was declared mentally incompetent. Those 2 terrible words echoed in my mind for days. Mentally incompetent. Now I understood. Now all of Robert's casual, cruel insinuations made a horrifying kind of sense. His suggestions that I was confused, that maybe I needed to see a doctor, that my memory wasn't reliable, it wasn't genuine concern for my well-being. It was preparation. He was laying the groundwork, building a fraudulent case to have me legally declared incapable of managing my own affairs. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The plan wasn't just to gradually bleed me dry. The ultimate plan was to take everything from me in one fell swoop, using that power of attorney, and then, I had no doubt, to place me in some soulless assisted living facility where I would no longer be a problem for their new, perfect stolen life. I decided I needed professional help, but I knew I couldn't trust the family lawyer Robert had so helpfully recommended to me 2 years ago. In secret, using the library computer to avoid leaving a digital trail, I researched and found a lawyer specializing in family law and elder financial abuse. Her name was Andrea King. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, and when I sat in her quiet office and told her my story, her expression grew very, very serious. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice firm but kind, "what you are describing to me is a classic, textbook pattern of family financial abuse. Sadly, we see these kinds of cases far more frequently than people can possibly imagine." She confirmed that my worst suspicions were correct, that the documents I had signed had indeed given Robert a dangerous level of control over my assets. "Can I do anything to regain control?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Andrea nodded decisively. "Yes, but it's going to require solid, irrefutable proof that you were tricked into signing these documents under false pretenses. We also need to demonstrate beyond any doubt that you are completely mentally capable of making your own decisions." She asked me to bring her every single document I could find, and she also suggested something I hadn't considered, reviewing the records of calls and text messages between Robert and Danielle. "Often, in these cases," she explained, "the perpetrators communicate their plans to each other. If we can prove there was a deliberate conspiracy to deceive you, that greatly strengthens your case." That night, as I lay in bed, wondering how on earth I could get that kind of information, I remembered something. A year ago, Danielle had stayed over at my house because Robert was away on a business trip. She had used my old desktop computer to check her email, and I remembered her complaining that the browser had automatically saved her password. I had never felt comfortable with the idea of spying, but this was no longer about comfort. This was about survival. With my heart pounding, I turned on the old computer, opened the browser, and accessed Danielle's email account. What I found there took the air out of my lungs. There were dozens, hundreds of emails exchanged with Robert, all about me. The old lady already signed the bank papers. Piece of cake. Once we have full control, we'll convince her to sell the house and buy something much smaller. The equity will be ours. My mom knows nothing about investments. We can manage her money however we want. It would be ideal if she decided to go to a retirement community. That way we'd have the house free and clear. But the emails that cut the deepest were the ones between Danielle and her friends. My mother-in-law is so naive. She believes every single thing we tell her. Robert says in 5 more years he'll inherit everything. In the meantime, we'll just use what we need for our lifestyle. The poor old woman thinks we're a happy little family. She has absolutely no idea what's coming. There were also emails with real estate agents casually inquiring about the market value of my house. There were quotes from private, high-end assisted living facilities, and there were even detailed conversations about how to manipulate me into moving. The key, Danielle had written to a friend, is to make her believe it's her own idea. If she thinks she's making the decision, she won't resist. Every email was a deeper, more painful stab. Not only were they stealing from me, they were mocking me, laughing at my gullibility, meticulously planning my future as if I were an inanimate object that had to be moved from one place to another according to their convenience. I printed everything, every email, every conversation, every cruel, calculated plan they had made behind my back. When I was finished, I had a stack of more than 50 pages of solid, undeniable evidence of their conspiracy against me. But just having the proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand exactly how much money they had taken and where that money was now. Over the next few days, I visited every bank where I had an account, requested detailed statements for the last 3 years, and asked for information about all the transactions I hadn't authorized directly. The picture that emerged was far worse than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just the $15,000 I had initially seen. In total, they had extracted more than $42,000 from my different accounts. My $25,000 certificate of deposit had been canceled prematurely, and the money had been transferred to an account Robert had opened to manage my investments more efficiently. I also discovered that my life insurance policy had been modified. Previously, I was the beneficiary of my own insurance, which meant that if I needed money for medical emergencies, I could access that fund. Now, Robert was the sole beneficiary, and the policy couldn't be modified without his authorization. Every discovery was like unearthing a new, more profound betrayal. For years, while I had deprived myself of small luxuries to save money, while I had switched to cheaper brands at the supermarket to spend less, while I had mended my old clothes instead of buying new ones, they were spending my hard-earned savings as if it were their own personal slush fund. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the bank statements, the phone rang. It was Robert. His voice sounded irritated, as it always did lately when he spoke to me. "Mom, the bank called me. They said you've been asking for a lot of copies of documents. What do you need all that for?" For the first time in weeks, I maintained a perfect, icy calm. "I'm just organizing my papers, son. You know, at my age, it's important to have everything in order." There was a brief pause. "Well, don't do anything without consulting me," he said, his voice sharp. "Remember, I handle these things for you now." "Of course, Robert," I replied, my voice so sweet and natural that even I was surprised. "I wouldn't dream of doing anything without consulting you." When I hung up, I realized something important. It no longer hurt to talk to him. The betrayal had been so complete, so calculated, so breathtakingly cruel that it had killed something vital inside me. The unconditional, all-consuming love I had felt for my son for 34 years had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't hatred, because hatred requires passion and energy. This was something colder, more detached, more methodical. It was the quiet, unshakable determination of a woman who had built her life from nothing and who was not going to let anyone, not even her own son, burn it to the ground. That night, as I carefully organized all the evidence I had gathered into neat labeled folders, I made a decision that would change everything. I was no longer going to be the passive victim. I was no longer going to pretend I didn't know what was happening. It was time to start the second part of my plan, getting back every single thing they had taken from me. And I would do it with patience, with strategy, and with the same calculated coldness they had used against me. Robert and Danielle had made a fundamental, fatal mistake. They had completely underestimated the woman they thought they had defeated. Their mistake was about to become my greatest advantage, and I was ready to use it. The first concrete action I took was something I never, in my wildest dreams, thought I would do in my life. I hired a private investigator. Andrea, my lawyer, had recommended a man named Jack Torres, a grizzled former police officer in his 50s who now specialized in complex cases of family fraud. When we met in his small but impeccably tidy office, I laid out all the evidence I had collected on his desk. Jack reviewed every document with the meticulous, practiced eye of someone who had seen this type of heartbreaking case many times before. "Mrs. Miller," he said, looking up at me, his expression grim, "you have done an excellent job gathering this preliminary information. But we need more. We need to go on the offensive. I need to trace exactly where the money they took from you went, and I also need to document the kind of lifestyle your son and daughter-in-law are leading with your resources." He explained that he was going to investigate Robert and Danielle's bank accounts, their recent big-ticket purchases, their investments, and any property they might have acquired. "If they are living a life that is demonstrably above their declared income," he said, his voice low and serious, "that will serve as powerful additional evidence that they are using your money illegally." While Jack began his work, I continued with my own quiet, personal investigation. I had learned to be incredibly careful, to leave no traces of what I was doing. Every time Robert called me, I played the part of the naive, slightly confused, but always concerned mother he expected me to be. Every time Danielle sent me a saccharine text message feigning concern for my well-being, I replied with counterfeit gratitude. A week later, Jack summoned me to his office. He had news, and the information he had uncovered took my breath away. "Mrs. Miller," he began, laying a series of glossy photographs on his desk, "your son and daughter-in-law have been very, very busy with your money." He showed me photographs of a flashy red sports car that Robert had purchased just 3 months ago, a car that cost $65,000, which he had paid for entirely in cash. There were also receipts for $15,000 worth of high-end furniture for their apartment, and an invoice for an $8,000 plastic surgery procedure for Danielle. Everything had been paid for in cash or with direct transfers from the accounts they controlled in my name. The photographs were accompanied by receipts, payment, vouchers, and official documents that proved every single transaction. But the most shocking discovery was the information about their real estate plans. They were looking at houses in an exclusive gated community just last week, Jack told me, his voice flat. Houses in the $300,000 range. The real estate agent confirmed to me that they mentioned they were expecting to receive a significant inheritance soon, and that they would be able to pay in cash. A significant inheritance they were expecting to receive soon. My inheritance. While I was still alive and breathing, they were already spending the money they expected to inherit upon my death. The sheer calculated coldness of that realization went through me like an icy cramp. Jack had unearthed even more disturbing information. "I also investigated the phone records you asked me about," he said, pushing another file across the desk. "Your son and daughter-in-law have been in frequent contact with a lawyer who specializes in declaring mental incapacity due to senility. Apparently, they have been consulting him about the legal steps necessary to gain total and complete control over all your affairs." He showed me copies of emails between the lawyer and Robert, where they discussed various strategies to demonstrate the cognitive decline of an older person. The lawyer had suggested documenting supposed episodes of confusion, obtaining testimonies of erratic behavior from friends, and creating a medical record to support a declaration of mental incapacity. Your son has been systematically building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent, Mrs. Miller, Jack concluded. If he had succeeded, he would have gained total legal control over all of your assets and every decision in your life. The magnitude of the betrayal was so immense that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Not only were they gradually stealing from me, but they were also actively planning to take everything from me at once and then lock me away somewhere where I would no longer be a problem for them. It was a plan so meticulously cruel, so diabolically evil, that it seemed straight out of a nightmare. But I was no longer the same woman I had been a month ago. The pain had been replaced by a cold, hard, calculated determination. Jack, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, what do I need to do to prove that I am completely sane and that they deliberately tricked me? He explained that I would need comprehensive psychological and medical evaluations to definitively prove my mental competency, and I also needed to document, with as much detail as possible, that I had been tricked into signing the documents under false pretenses. The good news, he said, offering a small, grim smile, is that we have clear, undeniable evidence of conspiracy and fraud. The bad news is that it's going to be a long, difficult, and costly legal battle. I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes, I told him, my voice resonating with a firmness I hadn't heard in myself in years. I want to get back every single thing they took from me, and I want them to face the consequences of what they have done. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed Andrea's instructions to the letter. I underwent extensive psychological evaluations with 3 different, highly respected specialists. All of them concluded that I possessed perfect mental capacity for my age, an excellent memory, and absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. The medical reports from my doctor demonstrated that I was completely capable of making my own financial and legal decisions. I also hired a forensic accountant who meticulously traced exactly where every single dollar of my money had gone. The final numbers were devastating. In total, Robert and Danielle had extracted, transferred, or spent more than $85,000 of my funds in the last 2 years. These weren't small, gradual amounts. They were large, calculated transfers that they had used to finance their extravagant lifestyle. The accountant discovered that they had opened investment accounts with my money, but the investments were held in their names. They had bought stocks, bonds, and certificates of deposit using my life savings as their initial capital. Technically, they had stolen my money to make even more money for themselves. Meanwhile, I continued to act as if I knew nothing. When Robert called, I maintained normal, mundane conversations. When Danielle sent her occasional cloying text messages, I responded with the same feigned cordiality as always. I even accepted an invitation to have dinner at their apartment, a place I now knew had been furnished with my money. During that dinner, I observed them with new, piercingly clear eyes. The way they exchanged secret, knowing glances when they thought I wasn't watching. The complicit, smug smiles they shared. The way they talked about their future plans, plans that never, not once, included me. Everything had a different, sinister meaning now that I knew the truth. Danielle proudly showed me her new ring, a large diamond that must have cost at least $5,000. "Isn't it beautiful, Mrs. Audrey?" she gushed. "Robert got it for me for our anniversary." I smiled and congratulated her, knowing perfectly well that the ring had been bought with my money. Robert talked about a new car he was considering buying. "It's a smart investment, Mom," he said, pontificating. "Good brand cars hold their value." I feigned admiration, already knowing he had the cash to buy it because he had taken it directly from my accounts. But the conversation that impacted me the most was when Danielle casually mentioned that they had been looking at houses. I Think it's so important to plan for the future, don't you, Mrs. Audrey? She said, looking directly at me. Especially when families change and needs are different. The way she emphasized the phrase, when families change, made me understand that they were already publicly planning for a future that did not include me. That night, when I returned to my own home, I sat in my quiet kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea and reviewed all the legal documents Andrea had prepared. Lawsuits for fraud, for elder financial abuse, for falsification of documents, and formal requests to regain full and undisputed control of all my assets. Everything was ready. I had the mountain of evidence. I had the expert witnesses. I had the medical documentation proving my mental competency beyond any doubt. And I had a complete, detailed paper trail of every single dollar they had stolen from me. But before I set the legal machinery in motion, I decided to give them one last chance. Not because I felt any inkling of forgiveness, but because I wanted to see if there was any tiny vestige of conscience left in the son I had raised. I wanted to know if, when confronted directly with the truth, Robert would show any sign of genuine remorse. The next day, I sent him a simple text message. Son, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over tomorrow? His reply was typical, dripping with his newfound arrogance. What is it now, Mom? I hope it's not another one of your confusions with the bank papers. His confusions. Even when I was giving him an opportunity to do the right thing. He still treated me as if I were a senile old woman who couldn't understand her own affairs. That single condescending response confirmed that I had made the right decision. There was no turning back now. While I was spending sleepless nights meticulously organizing evidence and holding clandestine meetings with lawyers, Robert and Danielle were living as if they were millionaires. Their social media accounts had become a constant, gaudy exhibition of the luxury lifestyle they were financing with my life savings. Every day, I checked their profiles, not out of masochism, but because Jack had explained that these public posts constituted additional valuable evidence of how they were spending my funds. Danielle uploaded almost daily photos of her culinary adventures at elegant restaurants where a dinner for two cost more than $200. There were pictures of imported wines that were worth more than my entire monthly pension, and artisanal desserts that looked like miniature works of art. In every single photo, she appeared beaming, tagging Robert and writing nauseatingly smug captions like, "Life is too short not to enjoy it to the fullest," or "We deserve the best." Robert, for his part, had developed an obsession with showing off his new, powerful professional lifestyle. He posted photos of his recently redesigned office with sleek, modern furniture that I recognized from the invoices Jack had obtained. There were images of him attending business meetings in exclusive private clubs where the annual membership fee was $5,000. He wrote long, self-important posts about his smart investments and strategic financial decisions. But the posts that hurt the most, the ones that felt like a physical blow, were the ones where they appeared together, blissfully happy, celebrating achievements that they had financed with my stolen savings. There was a photo from the day they bought the flashy red sports car, embracing in front of the dealership with the caption, "When you work hard, dreams really do come true." There was an image of Danielle wearing an $8,000 pearl necklace with the caption, "My husband knows how to make me feel special." There was something particularly cruel and brazen about the way they documented every single luxury. It was as if they were celebrating not only their good fortune, but specifically the fact that they had achieved it by deceiving and robbing me. Every post seemed like a secret message directed at me, a taunt, even though they had no idea I was seeing them. Danielle had also started posting vapid, inspirational reflections about life that sounded like direct mockery of my situation. Sometimes you have to step away from negativity to find true happiness. The real family is the one you choose, not necessarily the one you get by blood. When you free yourself from toxic people, your life flourishes in the most incredible ways. Toxic people, negativity. I, the woman who had worked for decades to give my son everything he needed, was now being publicly classified as the negative, toxic influence they had had to free themselves from. And they were doing it using the very money they had stolen from me to pay for the extravagant lifestyle that allowed them to feel so superior to me. Robert had adopted the condescending tone of a successful, self-made businessman, a persona he had never had before. He posted motivational quotes about making difficult decisions to protect your future and not letting guilt stop you from doing what's best for your family. He constantly talked about his new investment opportunities and his ambitious financial expansion plans. My money had become his investment opportunities. My decades of scrimping and saving had been transformed into his difficult decisions to protect his future. The most unbearable moment came on Mother's Day. Danielle had uploaded a glowing photo of herself with her own mother, accompanied by a long, saccharine text about mothers who truly love their children unconditionally and support them in their adult decisions. Robert had reposted that image with the sickening comment, "So lucky to have a mother-in-law who understands what true love really means." A mother-in-law who understands true love, while I, his own mother, was being implicitly, publicly classified as the obstacle they had had to overcome in order to be happy. But it wasn't just their social media. Jack had been following them discreetly and brought me weekly reports of their activities. They ate lunch at expensive restaurants at least 3 times a week. Danielle got weekly beauty treatments at a luxury spa. Robert had hired a private personal trainer that cost him $300 per session. They had started attending exclusive social events where they rubbed shoulders with wealthy, influential people. Jack had photographs of them at charity galas where the tickets cost $500 per person, at art auctions where they made bids of thousands of dollars, and at private parties in the mansions of well-known businessmen. They are systematically building a public image of financial success, Jack explained to me. They want to be perceived as a prosperous, powerful couple who belongs to the highest social circles. But their declared income does not, in any way, justify this level of spending. The only additional source of money we have recorded is the funds they have extracted from your accounts. The contrast was brutal and stark. While they were living like new money, I had started rationing my own expenses even more than normal. Not because I truly needed to, but because it was psychologically impossible for me to spend money, knowing that I was being actively robbed. I bought the cheapest brands at the supermarket. I mended my old clothes instead of buying new ones, and I had canceled small luxuries like my cable television subscription. One afternoon, while reviewing the most recent photographs Jack had brought me, I found something that made me feel physically nauseous. It was a crystal-clear image of Danielle in an elegant jewelry store trying on a diamond bracelet. The date stamp on the photo was from the day before, and the price, clearly visible on the tag, was $12,000. $12,000, more than I had spent on myself in the last 3 years combined. And she was trying it on as if it were the most natural thing in the world, something she deserved, something she had earned with her own effort. That very night, I received a call from Robert. His voice sounded strangely cheerful, more animated than I had heard it in months. "Mom, how are you? I wanted to tell you some exciting news. Danielle and I have found the perfect house. It's a little pricey, but we think it's a smart investment for our future." He went on to describe the house as if he were sharing genuinely good news with me. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large yard, a swimming pool, all in an exclusive neighborhood where successful doctors and lawyers lived. "It's going to cost $350,000, he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "But we have a solid financial plan to pay for it." His solid financial plan. My inheritance, which they were eagerly expecting to receive upon my death, combined with the money they had already stolen from me. "Don't you think it's exciting, Mom?" he asked. "We're finally going to have the space we need to grow as a family." Grow as a family. As if I were no longer a part of that family. As if my death was simply a necessary practical step in their ambitious growth plans. "It sounds wonderful, son," I managed to say, my voice miraculously stable. "I'm very happy for you." When I hung up the phone, I sat there in my small kitchen, in my house that was no longer completely mine, thinking about the $350,000 house they were going to buy with my money. Thinking about the $12,000 piece of jewelry Danielle had tried on the day before. Thinking about the disgustingly luxurious life they were living while treating me as if I were an annoying, burdensome problem that had to be managed. But I no longer felt pain. The pain had been completely replaced by something more powerful, more potent, the absolute, unshakable certainty that the time had finally come to act. Robert and Danielle had made the fatal mistake of completely underestimating the woman they thought they had defeated. Tomorrow would be the day they would discover just how wrong they were.